So we have several questions, but we also have a question which we said we will discuss in the evening session. And I think we'll first complete that question, and then we'll come to other questions. So the question which Krishnaji raised, uh, which according to him is the only relevant question which should arise from the biography. So the question is, how come that boy remain unaffected by all the praise, all the adulation, all the respect, and the kind of position he was given? So in spite of all that, how could he remain unaffected? Because otherwise, an ordinary person, when he is showered with all such praise and given all such powerful positions, then he does get affected. He does start thinking of him as someone great and then starts behaving like that. But it never happened with Krishnaji. He always remained as a simple, unassuming kind of human being. So what it was that kept him like that? Why he did not get affected by all these things? So according to Krishnaji, that is the important question uh, which comes out of this biography. So maybe we'll try to go into that question in order to understand how it would have happened. So before that, we'll have to understand how do we get affected by things around us. I think if we first inquire into that and understand more or less this process of getting affected by the various influences, then maybe we'll be in a position to inquire why that boy Krishna didn't get affected by any of these things. So when we had studied about consciousness in the workshop on consciousness, we said that the consciousness is made up of its contents, and most of this content, apart from factual, there is a lot of psychological content, and this psychological content is the one which responds to all the external stimuli or internal stimuli in terms of psychological reaction. So as long as there is a psychological content within us, we are always vulnerable to all the influences, because different influences or different inputs, they will stimulate different content in our consciousness. And when the content in consciousness is stimulated, is provoked, then it responds in the form of a psychological reaction. And that psychological reaction then becomes an event in the life of that person. And then out of that psychological reaction, further content gets generated and stored. And this process goes on all the time. So which means that as long as there is a psychological content, there is always a possibility of getting affected by whatever that is happening outside. Now, this psychological content has a kind of center around which all this content gets accumulated or gathered. And we call that as the self-center, the ego, or the sense of me. And when that ego or the sense of me is there, so around that, this whole content gets accumulated. And then that me plays with that content, does addition, subtraction, modification, accepts some content, rejects some content, and the whole play continues like that. And that becomes the life of that person. So, since all the psychological content is related to that center called me, the ego, in a sense, one can say that the only content, the only psychological content in the consciousness is the ego, because this ego is made up of all of the psychological content. So, this whole psychological content means the ego, because that is what uh, the ego is formed of. And therefore, in a way, the only psychological content in the consciousness is this ego or the self-centeredness. And as long as it is there, the person is always susceptible to all kinds of influences. So we also talked about thought as a field. So Krishnaji always said thought is a material process, and material process includes the field. So thought as a field, and then therefore anybody thinking in whatever way generates a corresponding field around him, and that field, anybody coming in the region of influence of that field will get affected by that thought. And this affection or this effect is through resonance. So whatever is the thought field, so if there is a content in a person which can resonate with that thought field, then whenever he comes under the influence of that thought field, the corresponding content start resonating, and therefore the corresponding psychological reaction arises. So this has the strengthening effect on both the things. It not only strengthens the psychological content in that person, but it also strengthens that thought field which has influenced that content. So if you do not have any psychological content corresponding to that thought field, then you will not get affected by that thought field. It is obvious, because you have nothing which can resonate with that thought field, and therefore you won't get affected by that thought field. But as long as you have something which can resonate with that, then you are likely to get affected. So which means that as long as there is a content of consciousness, we mean psychological content, there is always a possibility of getting affected by it. And that effect amounts to strengthening of that center as the me. So every time this content is affected, the final effect is the center, the self-center gets strengthened further. And so that is how it keeps on happening. Now let us consider the case of Krishnamurti. When he was discovered as a boy, So what was it that was noticed by CWL? CWL said that there was not even a particle of selfishness in the aura of Krishnamurti. So not a particle of selfishness, which means that there was no self-centeredness at all in that boy. So the self-centeredness, which is a very common thing with us, was completely absent in that boy. So naturally, without there being any psychological content, the boy was not affected by anything that was going on around him. So he had no sense of self as the me. And therefore, that is described as vacant mind. That means the mind of that boy was vacant. It had no content. And therefore, such a vacant mind, it remained unaffected because there is nothing in it which can get affected by whatever that is happening around. So any kind of thought field, any kind of influence, it simply did not find anything in that mind which could resonate with it. And therefore, uh, the mind of that boy remained unaffected. So the total unselfishness seems to be the key, seems to be the factor which was responsible for that boy not getting affected by any of that adulation, any of that praise, anything that was bestowed upon him. He was given the position of such importance. So none of that could affect him because his mind was vacant. Now the question is, how could his mind be vacant? Was he born like that? And if he was born like that, then does that mean that a person has a vacant mind either by birth or he doesn't have a vacant mind? So such questions, they arise. And if the vacant mind is possible only by birth, then whatever Krishnaji is talking about, it doesn't mean anything. Because you can't have a vacant mind. You have to be born with it. But Krishnaji says it's not so. And then the other question is, how could that mind remain vacant? What was there? So he did talk about some kind of protection. Now it is mentioned in his biography that his body needed to be protected. And therefore it was always seen that at least two initiates will always accompany a Krishnamurti. He will never be left alone, but there will be at least two initiates who will be always with him to protect him. So was that what was protecting him? Was that what was protecting that vacant mind? Or there was something more? So when this was discussed with Krishnamurti, he said he always had that sense of protection or that sense of being protected. And that sense of being protected was quite apart from the protection given by those two initiates. That means the protection of those two initiates had its place, but apart from that, there was this deep sense of being protected, which was not there due to those two initiates, but which was a factor by itself. It was a different. So, what was that sense of being protected? What was it that was protecting him? And Krishnaji also mentions that that also created some sense of responsibility in him, because he did not look at his body as his personal possession or his personal belonging, because usually a person is so much identified with his body that he considers that he means his body. There is such complete identification. But with Krishnamurti, it was not like that. He looked at the body as some instrument which had to be protected, which has to be looked after, because there was some definite function to be done through that instrument. So Krishnamurti did used to say that whenever he boarded a plane, he knew that nothing was going to happen. That means no accident was going to happen. He was safe because something was there to protect him. Something was protecting him, or protecting that body rather. Then if he wanted to participate in some adventurous game, right, then although howsoever he may want to participate, but then he used to always take a step back and said, no, he should not take any kind of risk, because the body needs to be protected. So he has mentioned about the gliding, that he very much wanted to uh, do the gliding, and he had such an opportunity while in Switzerland. But then when the time of taking advantage of that opportunity came, he took a step back and he said, no, he can't take that kind of risk. Not that something was going to happen, but he always avoided all the unnecessary risks, all the unnecessary activities which could have amounted to risk to his physical body. So he was very, very careful and uh, and protective about the physical body, because he knew that the body is specially prepared for a specific function, and that function is very important, and nothing else matters except that, and therefore everything should align itself as per that. So that is how he lived his life. So he was very particular about cleanliness and so on, or the atmosphere around him, the surrounding, and so on. Everything he was very particular. So this sense of being protected, so even if he wants to take a risk, he couldn't take a risk. So there is an interesting example of that, which is mentioned by Krishnaji himself in one of his writings, where he was staying in some cottage on a hill, and there was a village surrounded by forest around that hill. And then there was a news of spotting a tiger. A tiger was spotted in the forest near that village. And Krishnaji used to go for walks in the evening through the village into the forest. So he wanted to visit that forest and see the tiger. And so he went for a walk. And then as he entered the forest and he walked further, then there was at a particular spot, he felt that yes, the tiger is somewhere nearby, and he wanted to go and have a look, but his body simply refused to take a step further, as if the body was frozen and refused to move further in order to see the tiger. So finally he had to give up that thought of seeing the tiger, and then the body just returned. He took a back turn and returned. So on his return walk, as he was passing through some open space surrounded by trees, he felt that somebody is watching him. And so he looked around and he couldn't see anybody. And yet that sense was so real, so factual. And therefore he couldn't have missed it. So somebody is watching him, but then nobody is to be seen around. So then he looked up. And when he looked up, he saw large number of monkeys sitting on the trees and intently looking at him. And then he, of course, came back to his cottage. The point is that this protective mechanism, it also functioned quite independently of what he might have been wanting to do. So if there was anything which would amount to any kind of risk to the body, then probably that simply could not happen. So this sense of protection, it never left him. It was there till the end of his life. So what was it that was protecting him? When apart from initiates, there was some other factor which was protecting him. And why was it protecting him? Was it because he had that definite function, because the body was prepared to talk, and so talking was the main function of that body, and in order to fulfill that function, the body had to be preserved and protected. And so was it because of that the body was protected? So many such questions, they arose from this, and the obvious theosophical explanation that the world teacher must have protected it, the world teacher must have seen to it that the mind remains vacant and so on. So that was not much acceptable to Krishnaji. He said that that explanation is too simplistic. There must be a deeper cause, a deeper reason. But what that deeper reason could be, uh, it could never be investigated. And Krishnaji himself could not investigate it, because he said that water cannot know what water is. Only the person, only that thing which is not water itself can know what water is. But water itself cannot know what water is. So Krishnamurti cannot know what is Krishnamurti. But somebody else investigates, then he can find out what is Krishnamurti. And if he can find out, then Krishnamurti can corroborate it. He can tell whether that finding is correct or not correct. And so he was urging both the Marys, Mary Latens and Mary Zimbalist also. He said that you can find out what is Krishnamurti or who is Krishnamurti. And if you can find out, then it can be corroborated. but somehow it could not be done. And so we have nothing else except the explanation given by Theosophy as to what was Krishnamurti. But then, what could have been the deeper significance of that? That remained unexplored. But then, the veil on that was lifted slightly by Krishnaji himself in his last statement. That means the statement which was recorded before his death. And in that statement, he has tried to tell what went through that body, that supreme intelligence functioning through that body, and so on. So there, little bit he has probably tried to explain who Krishnamurti was. So the vacant mind seems to be the most important factor for that intelligence to function. And if we look at Krishnamurti's life, there wasn't much intellectual activity. Even as a boy, whatever description is available, so we find that Krishnaji was hardly thinking. He was not thinking at all. His mind used to be vacant. He used to be simply looking at things. And whatever he was looking at, his mind was still blank. It did not trigger any thinking process in him. And many times he was not even aware what he was looking at. So his mind remained vacant. If there were any intellectual activity, probably the mind couldn't have remained vacant, because then any activity of thought would have filled up the mind with all kinds of content. And that activity was absent in case of Krishnaji. So now the question arises that does one have to have a vacant mind right from birth, or is it possible for any human being to have that vacant mind? Now, the whole Krishnaji's teaching is about that. In fact, when he is talking about emptying the consciousness of all its content, in a way, he is talking about a vacant mind, how the mind can be vacant. Because when the consciousness is emptied of all its content, which means that it no longer has that self-center, it doesn't have that psychological center called the ego, then it is an empty consciousness, which amounts to a vacant mind. And only such a vacant mind is capable of having that intelligence. That means that intelligence can function only to such a vacant mind. So when he says, if they live the teachings, so living the teachings means through constant observation, working out all the psychological content and not letting new psychological content getting formed. And that is possible by living one's life with full attention. So if that is done, then naturally in the vacant mind, that intelligence can function to whatever extent possible. So finally, we come back to what Krishnamurti has been talking about: the attention, the awareness, the observation, and so on. So these are not merely words, but these are the things which one has to actually do in one's life in order to uh, have the effects uh, of these things. Now somebody has raised somebody has asked some questions. I think Mr. Prashant Dikshit has raised two questions. So I will take up those two questions first, and then maybe we can take up the other questions.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Yeah. The first question is Krishnaji's teaching is about thought process or about thought as a system. What is thought and how it governs our entire life? So this is the first question. Now Krishnaji has given a very clear definition of thought by saying that thought is the response of memory. So when a memory responds, that response is nothing but thought. So from the environment, all kinds of inputs are entering our brain through sensory organs. We have 5 sensory organs: eyes, nose, ears, skin, tongue, and so on. So through those sensory organs, all kinds of inputs are entering our brain, right? And then the memory responds to those inputs, and that response is visible in the form of thought. And through that thought, then, according to that thought, we act. And then that action has its own consequences, or through that action, an experience is generated. And we go through that experience, and again from that experience, we accumulate a lot of knowledge, which gets stored in the memory. So this process constantly goes on. Now here, the thought is not simply functional kind of thought, but it has a psychological component. And so even that psychological component gets recorded. And so whenever there is a response of memory, that response also always has a psychological component in it. And that psychological component is responsible for creating all kinds of psychological states within us. So when we hear some statement, then corresponding to that statement, there is also a psychological response in the form of getting psychologically affected. So if we hear a praise, then we feel nice. So feeling nice is the psychological response. And then we like it, so we continue with it. Or hearing some statements, we feel very bad. So feeling bad is again a psychological response. And then the action based on that psychological response will be according to that. That means we may avoid such a person who is saying bad things about us, and so on. Now, what Krishnaji is talking about is whether it is possible to live our daily life without generating the psychological content. Because psychological content is what is the root of all our problems. If thought functions objectively, logically, rationally, in the area where it is required, and doesn't enter the area where it is not required, then there is absolutely no problem. But it is not so. The thought always interferes in the psychological realm also. And that's why all these problems. So by paying attention and through observation, it is possible that even if there is a psychological reaction arising, that reaction can be lived through and ended, so that no psychological residue is left behind. So the memory has only the factual content and no psychological content. So Krishnaji is talking about that. So he's not talking about a particular thought, or he's not talking about thought as a system. He is talking about thought interfering in the psychological realm and therefore creating a psychological content. And From that psychological content, the center as the ego, as the me, is getting formed. So he's talking about all that. And he's also trying to show us how is it possible to live one's life without generating further psychological content. And also how to work out the psychological content which has been already generated and accumulated. So he's talking about that. So I think that takes care of the first question. And the second question is, awareness is only tool, if we can use that word, with us. What is awareness? Awareness in thinking and awareness about thinking. Whether it is awareness in thinking or whether it is awareness about thinking. Now, I think first of all, we have to understand what we mean by awareness. So when we are aware of something, it only means that we are awake to that something. That means we are able to sense that thing. So when you actually wake up from sleep, right, so the whole waking process, in that we see how the awareness arises. So as we are waking up, we are aware of the surrounding. We just, first of all, we are aware that yes, there is an awareness of existence, I exist. And then there is an awareness of the surrounding. But it is a vague awareness. But as you wake up further, and then you are aware of more details of the surrounding. And when you are fully awake, you know exactly, or you are aware exactly where you are, what are the things around you, and what is the situation. So that awareness. So awareness could be about external things. Awareness could be about what is happening within oneself. So if a thought arises, then there can be awareness of that thought. And when there is some psychological reaction that arises, there can be awareness of that psychological reaction. So awareness means you have sensed the existence of that object or of that thing. And then out of that awareness arises the attention, which means that your awareness gets focused on that in order to understand further details, in order to be aware of further details. And so then it is called as attention. And through attention, the learning process happens and one understands things. So that is how it functions in our life. Now, attention has to be differentiated from concentration, because in attention there is no center from which you attend, while concentration always has a center, which means that if you choose where to pay your attention, then it is no longer attention, then it becomes concentration, because you have already chosen where to pay your attention. And once you have made your choice, then it is not awareness also, because awareness doesn't have any choice. And when the choice is made, then it is no longer awareness. And then it becomes concentration. And in concentration, there is always this conflict, because concentration is always followed by distraction. Because there are other things which are also demanding your attention. And since you have already made your choice, so you say that that other thing is not now. I want to pay attention to this thing first. And so the struggle begins. So concentration and distraction, concentration and distraction. And then that has its own effect on the brain in the form of fatigue, heavy head, and finally you give up the whole process for the time being at least. But attention is not like that. Concentration is exclusive, but attention is inclusive. That means when you are paying attention to something and something else arises, then you don't exclude that something else. That something else is also paid attention to. So it goes on like that. And by paying attention to a psychological reaction, it is possible that psychological reaction coming to an end without generating any psychological residue. And therefore, no psychological content is getting formed. So that is possible if we attentively live through that event or through that psychological reaction. I mean, the simplest example could be if somebody says something which is hurtful to you, then that reaction of hurt, if you are able to live through it with full attention, then all the psychological content in that reaction comes to an end. And therefore, no psychological residue is formed. And therefore, there is no psychological memory of the event. Although there may be a factual memory, which says that, well, such person had said such and such thing to me, and because of that, I had felt hurt. But that was just a factual memory that remains behind. And eventually, even that goes. So it is possible to live in that way. So that is what Krishnaji's teaching is all about. So he's talking about what attention means, how one can live one's life attentively. Then he talks about the observation, because only by paying attention, the observation is possible. You can't observe without attention. And then the art of observation, the art of listening, the art of learning, right? Emptying the content of consciousness. And then finally coming to that vacant mind, which is capable of touching that intelligence, that different dimension of existence. So that is how he puts things. So this is a very brief, you can say, summary of what Krishnaji talks about this awareness and thought process and so on. Now we can take up, I think, the other questions.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can the same thing which you have discussed regarding concentration and attention
Yes.
be applied to learning skills, or it is just the psychological part of our
No, it is
process?
applicable to learning all kinds of skills. Let's say you want to learn driving, then you have to pay attention. Anything you want to learn, any new thing you want to learn, you have to pay a lot of attention to it, right? And as you learn, then probably you don't need to pay so much attention. But learning is possible only by paying attention. Of course, when you choose the object of your attention, then it becomes concentration. But it's okay. I mean, at the physical level, the concentration is required to learn, no doubt. But then at this, in the psychological realm, the concentration doesn't work, because there you cannot choose what you want to learn about, because there is no option there in the psychological realm. At the physical realm, you have options, whether you want to learn driving, or whether you want to learn painting, or whether you want to learn language, right? Or whether you want to learn whatever it is, So you have a choice. You can choose. You can decide what you want to learn, and then according to that you pay your attention. But in psychological realm, you cannot decide that now you want to learn about anger, or you want to learn about jealousy, or you want to learn about this or learn about that, because these reactions, they don't arise according to your wishes. They arise according to the provocation that happens to you due to the environment around you or due to your own thought activity. And therefore, these psychological reactions, as and when they arise, you have to be attentive to them, which means that there is really no choice as far as observing psychological reactions is concerned. So when you are feeling jealous, you can't say that, no, but I have to first pay attention to anger, and I must understand anger first, and then I will come back to jealousy. But then there is no feeling of anger at that time. So how can you observe it? So there you cannot have a choice at all. Whatever that comes up has to be observed. So you cannot decide beforehand what you want to pay attention to. But whatever that comes up, you have to pay attention to that. There is no choice there. So at the physical realm, it works in a different way. In the psychological realm, it works in a different way.
When does awareness become attention? Or
Thank you,
rather,
sir.
what is the difference between awareness and attention?
Yeah, in attention, the energy is getting focused. While in awareness, there is no focusing of energy. I mean, you are simply aware. That means you are sensing the existence of things around you with all the details. But attention is focusing the energy getting focused on that which is being paid attention to. And that has its own effect. So if attention is paid to a psychological reaction, then the energy of attention is getting focused on that psychological reaction. Right? And as a result of which, all the whole nature of the psychological reaction gets revealed to you. So that is the difference between attention and awareness. But,
Sir,
but
Krishnaji,
awareness comes first. And
yeah.
out of that awareness, then the attention comes,
Okay.
when the
Sir,
energy gets focused.
Krishnaji talks of total attention, where
Yes,
in fact he calls it the flame of attention.
yes.
What does it mean, and how that
Yeah,
total
flame.
attention can be?
Yeah, the flame indicates the energy.
Yeah, yeah.
And he says in the flame of attention, all the reactions are burnt, all the content is gone.
Yeah.
It is all burnt out. So this energy of attention, that energy changes the very thing which is being paid attention to. So when you pay attention to something and that something is seen as false, the moment it is seen as false, it is finished. It is no longer existent. It gets dropped. So that is the energy of attention. While the energy of thought is different. I mean, first you will think and then you will conclude that yes, it is not right, it is wrong. And even after a conclusion, the wrong can continue because you may keep on postponing the action which you are supposed to take vis-a-vis that wrong thing. And therefore, it may still continue. So the action may not result out of intellectual understanding. But when you are paying attention, right, attention is altogether a different quality. The attention is capable of comprehending or understanding the whole nature of the object which is being paid attention to. And therefore, there is always a possibility of that object undergoing a total change. Now, for a psychological reaction, the only change possible is the ending of psychological reaction.
Yes, yes.
That's what happens.
Thank you,
Kishorji,
sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Isn't it a universal phenomena that all human beings are born with a vacant mind? Or does this specifically happen to Krishnamurti and not to other human beings? What do you feel about it?
I think probably we are not born with vacant mind because we are inheriting all the psychological content that has been produced by humanity. So we are already born as a conditioned human being. And then whatever the inputs from the environment, according to those inputs, the corresponding content gets provoked and manifests in terms of various reactions, and out of those reactions, various activities arising, and then the life of that individual starts taking shape according to that. So I don't think we are born with a vacant mind. We are born as conditioned human beings. But how come Krishnaji was born with a vacant mind?
Yes.
And that is the mystery.
So my question is this, sir. See,
Yeah,
just a society discovered him. Annie Besant protected him,
yeah,
and she fought the lawsuit and all that.
yeah,
She gave him best of educations,
yeah,
even though he didn't qualify to Oxford or Cambridge.
yeah,
But she taught him French, Sanskrit, everything.
yeah,
And when she bought that piece of land at Ujjayi, and where
yeah,
he lived,
yeah,
and where he had the process,
yeah,
and all this problem. Then he resolves the order of the star and
yeah,
asks Besant to return all the properties.
yeah,
She returned many of the properties, but says, Krishnamurti, you have to have some properties. She prevails upon him to have Vasanti Vihar at Chennai and his property at Benares, then at
yeah,
England,
yeah,
Inchwood,
yeah,
then Ujjayi, and she gave the money also. Money
yeah,
you must have. And
yeah,
she asked
yeah,
some people in society to join him and protect him, especially Rajagopal and others.
yeah.
And after all that, he never acknowledged the contribution of Mrs. Besant.
Are you saying that all of that Krishnaji never acknowledged?
Yes. Why? And
No, it is
moreover,
not so.
where he
Krishnaji had great regards for Annie Besant, and
yes, only one.
he really considered her as his mother. He always referred to her as Amma.
Yes.
And in fact, in that dialogue, uh, he is having with the scientist, he's actually, he said there that how could he hurt Annie Besant? After all, she was her Amma. She was his Amma. So he can't do anything which will displease her. So he had that kind of regard for her. He always referred to her as his mother. And
I
he
agree,
had
sir.
very high regards for her. And
But
she also did all her duties which a mother is supposed to do for her child. So she was very much concerned that when there is no organization like Order of the Star in the East, and he has returned all the property and money, then how he will, what about his livelihood, how he will survive, and so on. So she was greatly concerned with that. And therefore, they tried to create some kind of infrastructure which could support him physically, and also which will support his work as a world teacher. So therefore, the individuals were appointed, like say, they started this Krishnamurti Writings Incorporated. That organization was started. It was only of a functional nature. It was not a spiritual organization. And then the funds were provided to all that organization to arrange for his talks and so on. And Rajagopal himself was an excellent organizer. So he managed very well all these things. So getting donations, keeping accounts, and arranging Krishnaji's talks, publishing his works, and so on. So he did very good management of all these things for many, many years. So all these
But
things,
he,
Krishnaji
but he
had
never
great regards, great feeling for Annie Besant. Not only that, even he went a step further. Now, this is not on record, but this was told by Radha Vernier, who was the president of Theosophical Society. So we were good friends, and then whenever I used to go to Chennai, I used to always see to it that I would meet Radhaji and have some conversation with her. In one such conversation, she asked Krishnaji that among all the people whom you have come in contact with, who could have been the person who could have understood exactly what you are teaching? That means, who could have been that person who could have understood exactly what you are teaching? So he mentioned the name of Annie Besant. He said, among all those people, he could only think of Amma, who was really capable of understanding what he is talking about and who could exactly understand the way he expected others to understand. Because he said she had that kind of brain. She had a brain who could end everything which was there at that moment and start afresh completely. So she had that kind of brain. And so he can think of only her as the person who could have understood his teaching the way he expects us to understand. So he had that high regard for her. And he didn't make a secret of it. When wherever it was necessary, he did mention about it.
but he never visited her after the break.
Of
I
course,
don't
he
think
visited.
when after
Yeah, yeah.
1920.
No, Dr. Annie Besant passed away in 1933.
True.
So before that, when he had seen her at Adyar, and in fact, it is mentioned in his biography. If you can take little trouble to look at that passage, where he is describing how his meeting with Amma was and how he felt sorry for her because her body was in quite a dilapidated condition, and then even in that state, she was only concerned about him, whether he has enough money, whether how is his health, and in what way his work is going on, and so on. So he did meet her in 1933. And not only that, but even CWL, because CWL was present with Annie Besant when she passed away. After that, CWL started traveling from Adair to Australia, to Sydney. And he traveled by a ship. And when he was at Perth, that is where he also passed away. So that was about 6 months after the death of Annie Besant. CWL also passed away. And that time, Krishnaji happened to be in Sydney. And CWL's body was carried from Perth to Sydney, where it was cremated. So Krishnaji attended that cremation of CWL in Sydney. So he was present there in both the occasions. He had seen Dr. Besant on her deathbed, and he was also present for the cremation of CWL in Sydney.
But he never had any regard for Arundale or others.
Yeah, for others he didn't have any regards. That is true.
I think he was cordial
Yeah.
with him. He didn't have regard would be a wrong thing to say. Na? He was such a gentleman.
Madam,
So what I feel is Krishnaji didn't have regard is a wrong thing to say or incorrect thing to say. He was cordial with them because he was cordial with everybody. So that's what people say, that he was such a great, he was impeccably brought up by the British people, and so he had great manners and all.
Yeah.
That he
That is true.
slapped him.
What we can say is
CWL
that
had
he,
slapped him when he was young on his route because he would leave it open. So he had just slapped him and said that ended the relationship. But he was cordial, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's a point which I'm glad you have raised it, because that is an important point. We'll talk about it. But what we can say is that Krishnaji never had any ill will towards anybody. So howsoever he might have been troubled by that person, but still he never thought ill of that person, because it was not in his nature at all. If he was a manifestation of compassion, then that compassion cannot turn into hatred or cannot turn into ill will. It is just not possible. So compassion will always be a compassion. So in that sense, he was compassionate towards everything. Doesn't matter what that person might have done to him, but still his response was only in the form of compassion. So in that sense, we can say that yes, he was never disrespectful towards anybody. He was always very courteous. But then when it came to the understanding and inquiring into his teaching, there he was uncompromising. So there he was not concerned whether the other person is getting hurt or not getting hurt. But if he felt that other person is really getting hurt, then he didn't forget to say sorry to that person, even during discussion. He would say that, sorry, I didn't mean personally to you. So like that, he always had been very, very courteous with other human beings. So there is no question of being disrespectful or regardless, being regardless towards other person. That was not simply his nature. So only thing is that what we can say is that, well, he was not much concerned with others in Theosophical Society like Arundel, Wedgwood. They had their own ways of life, their own activity, and so on. And so Krishnaji was naturally not interested in any of that. So he didn't have much concern in that sense. But then whenever there was an opportunity, he did, I think, contact them or meet them. So that was it. But then the other point about that statement in the biography, that Krishnaji had this habit of gazing at something with his mouth wide open, and then CWL constantly reminding him to close his mouth, and this boy all the time forgetting it, and therefore that habit was getting crystallized or established, that his mouth remaining open. So finally he had to just slap him under the chin to make his mouth shut. So it is mentioned in the biography that that slap under the chin ended all the relationship between CWL and Krishnaji. But I think that is the interpretation of the author of the biography, that is Mary Littens. Because if you read through the whole of biography, you find that the author has been little bit unkind towards CWL. She doesn't talk well about CWL, and at many places she does make statements which can create some kind of doubt about CWL in the mind of the reader. But then, what could have been the significance of this mouth keeping closed? Why CWL felt it so important that he did not mind even slapping to make it happen? Unless it is very important, right? CWL may not resort to such drastic action. So what could have been the importance of keeping the mouth closed? So the answer to this question is not given in any biography or anything. But since I had worked in the archives and I came upon some document of some discussion where this point becomes very clear. We talked about process in the morning, and we said that even in India at Uti, this process took place. And Upul Jaikar and Nandini Mehta, they were the people who were present with Krishnaji at Uti, where they were the witness of that process. And then Upul Jaikar made a write-up describing all that she saw when that process was happening. So there is a written or typed document of that description that is there in the archives. And then in 1979 in Mumbai, there was a discussion about Krishnaji's process at Uti. And in that discussion, both these sisters, Upul Jaikar, Nandini Mehta, then other trustees, Radha Barnier, all those people, they were present. And then they were discussing about this process which took place at Uti. And there Krishnaji was asking these two sisters what was actually happening when that process was taking place. And he was asking them to describe and so on. And then they are describing it. Then they said that before the process started, he used to instruct these two sisters not to touch his body at all when the process is going on, except when they find his mouth open, then they have to just close that mouth. Except for that, they should not touch his body in any way. So which means that during the process, if his mouth is found open, then he wanted them to close it. He didn't want his mouth to remain open. So what was the significance if his mouth remained open? What could have happened? So that question was asked to him. That is when he said that the mouth remained open, he could have slipped out of his body. Which means that he could have left his body forever. He could have been dead. So that indicates the importance of keeping his mouth closed. How important it was. And so naturally, when keeping the mouth open was becoming a habit, that habit had to be broken somehow. And probably CWL use that method to break that habit, because it was very important to keep the mouth closed. So there are such significances. There are many, there could be many more such significances which are not very obvious, but then which can form a kind of misunderstanding or an incorrect image about certain characters which appear in that biography, can easily become prejudices against those characters. Yeah, so now we can come back to questions, Navinji. We can take
Yes,
those
yes,
questions.
the sir, the people or associates of Krishnaji could feel the presence of that energy whenever they were with Krishnaji in a room or even in gatherings. Could the psychological nature of people around Krishnaji get changed or drained of his direct presence?
Yes, it's a good question, and we have talked about these matters during other meetings also. So we'll just briefly go through this. Yes, certainly. Krishnaji always carried a special quality of presence with him. And whenever Krishnaji was around, one could feel that presence. I mean, any sensitive person could feel that presence. And people have felt it. Not only that, during the discussion also, whenever a certain point of understanding used to be reached, at that point, a completely different kind of silence used to descend. And that silence was also very much noticeable by the participants, because then nobody would be interested in asking any question. Everybody just wanted to remain with that silence, and nobody wanted it to end. And it also gave a different kind of understanding, a different perception of the issues that were being discussed. That means there used to be a feeling that yes, the issue is completely understood. There is a full clarity about that, and there is nothing further needs to be inquired into or investigated. So there were many occasions during the discussions with Krishnaji where such different presence could be felt. The atmosphere around him was always an atmosphere of joy that could be felt. And then there was always that compassion, that affection, which was also very much noticeable. So he always carried that kind of thing with him wherever he went. And that influence used to remain in that place for quite some time, even after he had left that place. So it was very much there. The second part is in what way the people around him got affected by that presence. Now, because the compassion doesn't make distinction between good and bad, between right and wrong. Compassion is compassion. It is compassion towards everything. So, in the energy of compassion, everything in the person will grow. So, whatever is the content of our consciousness, all of that will grow in the presence of that compassion. So, which means that if we have some bad things or bad content in us, that will also grow. And if we have some good content, that will also grow. Everything will grow because there is no preference. The compassion doesn't distinguish. It is that kind of goodness, which is always goodness towards everything. There is without any distinction. So therefore, people around him, if they have lots of negative content in themselves, and that negative content also grows, and when it grows to such an extent that it becomes uncontrollable for them or unmanageable for them, then they start feeling uncomfortable in the presence of Krishnaji. And therefore, they want to run away from him. They want to get away from him as much as possible. But the moment they come in his presence, there is that feeling of acute discomfort because the negative content has grown. So such people, they came in contact with Krishnaji, they remained with him, worked with him for some time, and when they reached that kind of situation, they parted their ways with him. So they left him. So many such people I have seen coming in contact with him and then going away from him. And then there is also the growth of the positive content, the good content. So such people, they remained with him in spite of whatever could have been the circumstances. So although they might have gone away from the organization, from the K organization, but they didn't go away from K. So the teaching remained as the essential part of their life. They never moved away from it, although they might have moved away from the organizations of Krishnamurti. So there are many such examples also. So how a person got affected by the teaching or by that presence, the quality of that presence, it mostly depended upon the content that person carried in him, the psychological content that he carried in him. That mostly decided what would happen to that person when he is subjected to the influence of that presence. So I think we have answered that first question.
Sir, apologies for a speculative question, but the seals and saints we hear about, like Ramana Maharishi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, etc., did they also have only a touch of that intelligence?
That how do we know? I mean, the followers of those people, they would very much like that they had that touch of intelligence. But we have no way to verify or find out whether they had the touch of that intelligence. Now, we have talked about exploring or studying the teachings. And when we were talking about meditation and then how to pay attention, how to hold some statement in the mind and then let that statement reveal its whole content so that there is completely a different kind of understanding of that statement. So we had talked about it when we were considering what is meditation. So there we said that if that statement had some truth, some content, which is really truth, then that will unfold and then the exploration will further continue. But if that statement doesn't have any such content, right, then when you dwell upon that statement, hold it in your mind, and when the statement starts unfolding, you will find that that statement simply gets dropped because there is no corresponding content behind that statement. It's just some intellectual statement. It doesn't have any actual content behind it. The content, we mean not intellectual, but something. Because when we say the word intelligence, then there is definitely some content behind that word intelligence. Right? But if we are unable to touch that content, then we will be merely left with the intellectual concept of what we mean by intelligence. And that intellectual concept will have no content behind it. And if you hold that intellectual concept in your mind, and if it unfolds, then you will find that it will simply get dropped because it doesn't have any content behind it, but just an idea. So that can give you a clue. So if you are really interested in any of those seers, you can take their statement. So you study what Ramana has taught. Take any statement from his teaching and try to delve deeply into it. Hold it in your mind. Let it unfold. And if there is any truth behind it, right, it will get revealed. And then you can further go deeper into it. So that will be an indication that yes, what Ramana was saying was true. And therefore, you can say that probably he had that touch of intelligence. But if that statement just gets dropped because there is no content behind it, then you cannot say. Then you may say that maybe you can try some other statement. And like that, if you investigate and if you find that none of the things which he talked about has any content which can stand the scrutiny of your inquiry, then it is better to give up the whole thing and not bother oneself whether they had the touch of intelligence or didn't have the touch of intelligence. But this requires quite a lot of work on the part of the investigator, because he has to learn what is the real meditation. And unless he has learned and is able to be in that real meditative state, he won't be able to examine the truth behind many such statements. And so, if he is capable of such kind of meditation, then maybe he may not be interested any longer in finding out whether so and so was realized or not realized. So it's not a question, but people are usually only superficially interested. The thought is always comparing. It is always comparative. It always wants to compare whether so and so was also realized or whether so and so had that touch of intelligence. And then people, they have their own attachments. So some people may be attached to their saints, traditional saints. So somebody will say that yes, the Sant Ganeshwar also said the same thing what Krishnaji said, or Tukaram said the same thing, and then they may try to explain. But that is at the intellectual level, that is at very superficial level. The actual content hasn't been tested at all, because when you test the actual content, then you are no longer interested in such superficial things to find out whether so and so is also realized or not realized and so on, because you can exactly understand what is the position of that person vis-a-vis what he has taught. So I think this question, if one is really interested in finding out, then one has to do a lot of work on oneself. One has to really find out what is true meditation. And only in that meditative state, one can answer or find out the truth behind such questions. But if the interest is superficial and it is mostly the intellectual curiosity, then I think there is no answer to this question.
Sir, why did Krishnaji break away from Theosophical Society? In what way are the teachings different from Theosophy?
Yes, because if he did not leave Theosophy, then his teaching would have been interpreted according to the framework of Theosophy. And then only those people who believed in Theosophy would have shown interest in what he is talking about. And most of the humanity then would have remained far away from him. But by dissociating himself from Theosophic and Theosophical Society, right, he became available or accessible to the whole of humanity, because then he was not associated with any particular philosophy or any particular religious thought or religious organization. Whatever he was talking about, he could say that it was applicable to any human being living in any part of the world, belonging to any nation, belonging to any religion, belonging to any race, right? So that helped in establishing the universality of what he was talking about. Not that he needed to establish that, because what he was talking about was universal. But then people had to know that it is universal. So probably, in a way, his dissociating himself from Theosophical Society actually helped the cause of the teaching, because then the people were seriously interested in finding out that. Because you see, the human mind is such that the moment you categorize something, then your interest in that something is over. Say, for example, you are listening to somebody, and while you are listening, you are comparing what you are listening to what you already know. And then, in that comparison, if you find that what you are listening to exactly fits into this framework in your mind, then you immediately categorize what you are listening as exactly according to that framework. So you will say that, oh, Krishnaji, he talks the same thing what Osho talks, or Krishnaji, he talks the same thing what Nisargadatta talks. So the moment you categorize, then your investigation stops, because you have already concluded that what Krishnaji says is exactly same as what Ramana says, or exactly same as what Nisargadatta says, and therefore you are no longer interested in investigating further. So the inquiry stops there. So if Krishnaji belonged to Theosophy or Theosophical Society, then people would have already categorized, even without listening to him. They would have said that, oh, he is talking Theosophy only, and we are not interested in Theosophy. And therefore, probably it was necessary that he dissociated himself completely from any organization, so that whatever he was talking about would not be categorized according to any system of thought, according to any philosophy or framework of any philosophy. And therefore, people could have shown interest in that, saying that, oh, does it apply to my life? And if yes, then I'm interested. So I think in that sense, it was absolutely necessary that he dissociated himself from any organization. And the second part of the question is that how is it different from Theosophy? So Theosophy is a system of knowledge. It's the explanation based on knowledge of life or whatever life is all about. And that explanation has its own place, no doubt. But Krishnaji was not interested only in explanation. He was interested in actually finding out. So if we talk about intelligence, then it's not enough to understand what we mean by intelligence at intellectual level. But when we talk about intelligence, we have to actually come in touch with that intelligence. Or when we talk about love, then we have to be actually with that thing, what is called as love. So in that way, what Krishnaji is talking about, it differs from Theosophy. So therefore, we don't say that the Theosophy is redundant or insignificant. It has its place because it gives the most consistent theory as to what life is all about. But it is still a theory until such a time when it gets verified experimentally and by further investigation. But nevertheless, I would say it's a good theory to work upon. But in Krishnaji's approach, the inquiry is about the actual things, the what actually is, not the ideas. Because love is not an idea. Love is that energy, love is that compassion. So actually coming in contact with that compassion. So that is what was Krishnaji trying to point out. So even when during his talks, when Krishnaji does talk about the word, when he talks about love, so you can see that when he utters the word love, there is change in his expression. So it is not just word for him. When he talks about love, that quality, that energy is fully there with him at that time. And many times it does show by change in his expression. So for him, those were not just words, but they were the actual things. And that is, I think, the difference between the two approaches. So they need not be contradictory to each other. But yet, from whatever that has been said, one can easily understand or find out which is more important, which has to be given more emphasis.
This is the last question from the morning session.
Yeah.
Just one question. Yeah. So K was close to Nitya. Was Nitya also going through this process? How was he positioned in K's process of becoming world teacher? How was their relationship? Later, how did K take the loss of Nitya? How did K transform?
Yes. It's a big question. Of course, Nitya was not involved in the process at all. That means he was involved in the process as a witness, as a caretaker, because he was around Krishnaji and he could help in whatever way the help was needed. But process did not happen with Nitya. It happened only with Krishnaji. Then Krishnaji was greatly attached to Nitya as his younger, not only as his younger brother, but as a person. And in fact, he never wanted to be separated from Nitya at all. So when Dr. Annie Besant wanted to adopt Krishnaji, Then Krishnaji said that without Nitya, he won't accept that adoption. So if they want Krishnamurti, then they have to accept Nitya also. So therefore, both of them, they were adopted by Annie Besant. Then Nitya had a good intellectual capability, a good analytical brain. So he could complete his barrister education. He could get some degree. But Krishnaji was more or less dreamy and vacant, and so never passed any exam. In fact, whenever he was made to sit through the exam, he just sat there without doing anything. So whatever answer sheet was handed over to him, the same answer sheet he used to hand back, hand it over back to the examiner without writing anything on it. So naturally, he couldn't pass any exam and so on. And he remained attached with Nitya almost towards the end of Nitya's life. In fact, the death of Nitya was a great shock. Now, there is a significance of that, because we did talk about initiations and so on when we were talking about Krishnaji's life. And then there is an initiation, which is, they say it's the fourth initiation, where after that initiation, the initiate is called as the Arhat. And in Hindu system of initiations, he is called as Paramahamsa. While in Buddhist system of initiations, he is referred to as Arhat. So that is the fourth kind of initiation. So they say that Arhat is just one step before the Jivan Mukta. That means after Arhat, the next initiation frees the person from the cycle of birth and death. That means he becomes Jivan Mukta. He doesn't need to take birth anymore. So Arhat is just one initiation short of Jivan Mukta. Now they say that before a person gets that initiation of Arhat, he has to go through an experience of tremendous sorrow, an experience where he feels completely cut off from all life. He doesn't see any point in continuing to live. And yet, as he is going through that experience, right, he has to come out of it without breaking down. Because if he breaks down, then he won't get that initiation. So he won't become Arhat. So he has to go through that experience and come out of it without breaking down. And then when he comes out, he is already an Arhat. Now it is said that Nitya's death was such an experience for Krishnaji. He was on the ship, and the ship was passing through Suez Canal when he received the telegram saying that Nitya is no more. And that was such a tremendous shock. And he was crying. In fact, that time he was sharing a cabin on the ship with Rajagopal and one more person. I don't remember his name right now. And then they say that Krishnaji was unable to even sleep. Many times he would awaken from his sleep crying for Nitya and so on. So it took almost 10 days for Krishnamurti to come out of that sorrow without breaking down. And so when he reached Adyar after that voyage, and he met CWL, This was in 1925, the beginning of, or 1924 rather, the end of 1924, December. So the very first comment by CWL to Krishnaji was, "Now you are an Arhat." So that was the significance of Nitya's death in Krishnaji's life. So all these things are not explicitly mentioned in the biography, but when one does study the related material, this is the sense one gets that yes, that was the experience for Krishnaji, making him Arhat.
This question is from today's chat.
Yeah.
Sir, please clarify about his relationship with Rajagopal. Then there was a court case regarding properties and his final break with Rajagopal.
Yeah. See, Rajagopal, because after Nitya passed away, Nitya was actually supposed to take care of all the organizational matters of Krishnaji, so that Krishnaji is left completely free to do the work of the teachings, and while all the other organizational matters will be taken care of by Nitya. So that is what the kind of arrangement they had thought. But then when Nitya passed away, they needed somebody else to take up that responsibility. And they found Rajagopal. They thought Rajagopal was the right person. He had that capability and he could take care of that. And so he was given that responsibility. And Rajagopal was very good in organizing things. So he very systematically and nicely organized Krishnaji's talks, fixed his appointments. He also gathered funds by appealing to various people, and he managed all those money things. Then he was also a very good editor. So he could edit Krishnaji's works and then get them published. In fact, those 3 volumes of commentaries on living, they have been edited by Rajagopal, and they are such excellent books which are available in the collection of case books. So everything was going on very fine, and it seemed that yes, this will go on till the end. But then somehow, because Rajagopal was not a perfect human being as yet, and he was not free of this ego or whatever that psychological center we refer to. So somehow he started feeling jealous about Krishnaji. He started feeling that his work is also very much important compared to the work of Krishnaji. And then when he started thinking that in fact his work is far more important than the work of Krishnaji, then I think he started rather looking down upon Krishnaji. And then the person who was so careful, so much taking care of Krishnaji, he started neglecting him. And in fact, he was also became very short-tempered and so on. So it is mentioned that Krishnaji was wary of this short-tempered nature of Rajagopal. So whenever Rajagopal used to get angry, to the extent of violent expressions, Krishnaji used to keep away from him as much as possible. And he took utmost care not to provoke him in any way, so that that provocation doesn't result in that violent expression. And then the things, they started getting worse and worse, because Rajagopal was being completely taken over by his self-centered psychological reactions and always comparing with Krishnaji. And then at one stage he started saying that he could have been a better vehicle for the world teacher than Krishnamurti himself. And then, of course, also there were reports that he would collect funds from people by some false activity, in the sense that he may approach somebody and he would say that, yes, Krishnaji needs to travel for his talks from this place to that place. So can you help by paying the traveling expenses for this travel? So naturally the person would be interested, so he would pay for that. And then he would ask another person for the same expenses, and third person also. So from many different persons, he collected the expenses for the same travel. So there were many such discrepancies which came to notice, and so on. But then what happened was that, because Rajagopal was also a custodian of all Krishnaji's works, so if Krishnaji speaks and that talk is recorded, then that copy of that recording will be always handed over to Rajagopal. If Krishnaji writes something, then that manuscript will be handed over to Rajagopal. And he was supposed to preserve it, store it properly, right, and be a custodian of all that. So he did that work also very nicely, in the sense that he created a proper storing place, he created archives in Ojai, and he stored very systematically all the things, all the works of K, because he knew the historical importance of all those things. Right? But then he became very possessive about that material. So when actually Krishnaji needed that material, Rajagopal simply refused to give it to him. I mean, to give you an interesting example was the manuscript of Krishnamurti's notebook. So Krishnamurti wrote that notebook in 60s, in 1960, 61, 62, around that time he wrote, because he used to keep a diary and he used to note down his experiences or his psychological states, description of that. And so it turned out to be a document of more than 300 pages. And all of that was handed over to Rajagopal to keep safely. Then later on, towards the end of 60s, that was beginning of 70s, Krishnaji needed that document to be published as a book. And then Rajagopal was asked to hand over that document. And he refused to do it. He said, no, that document doesn't belong to Krishnaji, it belongs to me, it is my document. So I will never give it to him. So when such a thing happened, then what is to be done? So Krishnaji thought that this was the end of his relationship with Rajagopal, because anything which comes in the way of teachings, that was not acceptable to Krishnaji at all. And this manuscript, which needed to be published so that it becomes available to people, and Rajagopal was refusing to give it. So in 1969, during the Sanan gathering, Krishnaji explained to the participants, and he made a public announcement saying that he is dissociating himself completely from Rajagopal, and he has nothing more to do with him. So if people are interested in Krishnamurti and his teaching, then Rajagopal has no place in it. So they should directly contact him, that is Krishnaji. And then he also announced the formation of a separate foundation, which he called as Krishnamurti Foundation Trust. And that was registered in England. So he started that, and he said that Krishnamurti Foundation Trust will organize all his programs, his talks and meetings and everything. And if people are interested in helping, they should give the funds to this organization. And in making that announcement, Krishnaji had also talked about Rajagopal and the kind of difficulties he had with Rajagopal and so on. So he gave a detailed explanation. And it so happened that that Sanan gathering was being attended by a person from Ohio. His name was Albert Blackburn. So he recorded Krishnaji's statement. And when he went back to Ohio, he started showing that statement to other people in Ohio and telling them, see, this is how Rajagopal behaved. And this is why Krishnaji dissociated himself completely from Rajagopal. So then there was a talk of how bad Rajagopal is and how he has betrayed Krishnaji and so on. So when it came to Rajagopal, he took it as a great defamation for himself. And then to come out of that defamation or to stop it, he made an offer to Krishnaji, saying that he will hand over the manuscript of notebook to Krishnaji in return for all the copies of that recording where Krishnaji has announced his dissociation from Rajagopal. So Rajagopal wanted all the copies of that recording to be given to him, and in exchange, he will give or hand over the manuscript of that notebook. So this was immediately accepted by Krishnaji. And so whatever copies were there with the foundation and with others, they were handed over to Rajagopal. And then Rajagopal gave the manuscript to the American Foundation, and from American Foundation it came to Brockwood Park and then handed over to Mary Latens by Krishnaji in order to edit and publish as a book called Krishnamurti's Notebook. So this is just with regard to one document. But then Rajagopal was holding a lot of other recordings of Krishnaji, a lot of other manuscripts of Krishnaji, and which he was refusing to hand over. And so for that, then Krishnaji had to go through a lawsuit. And then when the American Foundation was formed, then the American Foundation took that responsibility of filing a lawsuit against Rajagopal and demanding the custody of all that material which actually belonged to Krishnaji. And when Rajagopal saw that he was going to lose that lawsuit, so suddenly he used to take a step backward and then hand over some material and then still continue with the remaining material and saying that he won't hand it over. And he did not even give the list of material which he was holding. So the other people had no idea what all the material Rajagopal had. So whatever they knew, only that much list they could present during that lawsuit. And only that much material Rajagopal handed over. But then the other material which they had no idea. Therefore, they couldn't demand from him. So it went on and on and on like that. And I think even when Krishnaji passed away, until that time, Rajagopal had not handed over all the material. Some of the material was handed over after many years after Krishnaji's death. And then when Rajagopal passed away, they found that a lot of that material he had sold to a library in California. It's called Huntington Library. So a lot of material was given to that library by Rajagopal. But that library also understood the importance of Krishnaji and his teaching, and they considered him as a historical figure. So whatever material they got, they in fact preserved it properly, took far more care than even foundation could have taken on. And then also they made all that material available to any scholar who is interested. So that is how the whole thing happened.
Sir, if my memory is right, Rajagopal died before Krishnamurti.
No, he died after Krishnamurti.
I see.
You can check it, you can search the net and find out exact date when Rajagopal passed away.
In net, there's not much about Rajagopal.
No, you have to take little trouble to find out, I think, because in the net also things are not readily available. You have to do a lot of work to search for the exact information you want.
Thank you.
So I'm ending the meeting now, and we'll meet tomorrow morning at 10:30.
Yeah. Thank you, Kishore.
So thank you, everybody,
Thank you, Kishoreji. Thank you.
and bye for the
Thank
time.
you.
Yes.
Thank you, Kishore.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.